Hello, and welcome to Dark Hearts with Stacy Lee. Before we begin, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel, share the channel, whatever you can do to help our community grow. It's been a slow month. I don't know if the algorithm doesn't like the rebrand, me renaming the channel, or if it's just January. I don't know what's going on, but it has been bad. You guys and the fact that you like the rebrand and you've said such kind things about it are literally the only thing keeping me sane right now. So thank you from the bottom of my heart. You can also join my Patreon. We have a big goal there, and I will talk about that at the end of the video. Last year, I brought you the story of the Lafferty brothers, Ron and Dan, who were the subjects of the Hulu miniseries Under the Banner of Heaven. I told you how that series is based on a book that I have always been very familiar with because the woman and the baby who are murdered in that story, that true story, are the sister and niece of a woman I was once very good friends with. More like sisters. Now, last year we did parts 1 and 2 of that story, Under the Banner of Heaven. In part 1, we tell the basic story, and then part 2, you guys said you wanted to hear more about the Lafferty brothers after what happened in episode 1. So if you have not watched those episodes, you may want to go back and do that before watching this one. All of the episodes done before January 1st, 2024, when the channel rebranded, have been moved to a single playlist called Dining with Death, which is the old name of this channel. So you'll have to dig around to find them. The first episode was published on April 26, 2022, and part 2 was published on August 9th, 2022. Now, I say you might want to watch them because today's story is tied to those stories in the most horrific way. Ron Lafferty died in prison years ago before the state of Utah could execute him. But Dan Lafferty is very much alive and still housed at the Utah State Prison. He is also still dangerous, as you will see today. If you remember, both Ron and Dan Lafferty, who were once mainstream Mormons, broke off and started their own offshoot brand of wacky Mormonism, proclaiming themselves to be prophets. Sadly, no matter how bizarre or ridiculous these types of people's claims are, there is always someone who believes them. And Dan Lafferty, he still has believers. Today, I have for you the tragic story of what happened to one entire family when a man and his wife fell into the conspiracy hole and began believing Dan Lafferty was a prophet, and then that entire family ended up dead. This is the story of the Strack family, Mommy and Daddy Doomsday. I'm your host, Stacy Lee. Let's begin. I'm going to start this episode with a very brief refresher on who the Lafferty brothers were and are. Ron and Dan Lafferty were a set of brothers from a very large and prominent Mormon family who lived in northern Utah in the 1970s. One of their brothers married this woman, Brenda Wright, who is my former friend's sister. And when Brenda told her husband that he was to stay away from Ron and Dan, his brothers, because they were crazy, which they were, and then Brenda also told Ron and Dan's wives that she felt they were justified in divorcing them because, again, crazy. Ron and Dan killed Brenda and her 18-month-old baby, Erica. It is a horrifying story that, again, you can hear the details of on my other 2 episodes. Ron and Dan Lafferty are put on trial and are convicted of this horrific crime. And then Ron attempts to take himself out in prison. He does this using a sheet tied to some bars. His attempt fails and leaves him deprived of oxygen for a period of time, which results in brain damage. Ron, who had long since lost his vertical hold, becomes even crazier. If you remember from part 2, we talk about his life in prison, how he proclaims that there is a demon after him named Lucifer Mussolini Moroni, and another one named Satan Hitler Watson. I wish I was joking, you guys. I really do. And then Ron, who there is some really solid proof had some sort of homosexual experiences in his life, begins wearing a sign taped to the rear of his prison pants that says exit only, because we all know that the most homophobic people are always, the call is always coming from inside the house. You know what I'm saying? So before Ron dies in prison, The wheels are turning, but the hamster is long dead. And then he gets sick and dies in prison, basically of old age, in 2019 before the state can execute him. This leaves his brother Dan alone. And Dan is currently around 74 years old. This photo was taken around 2015, so I'd reckon he looks much older than this now. That's almost 10 years when you're older and 10 prison years. So even with Ron and Dan locked up, they still had some believers. Most of them fell away during the long years of their incarceration. But as we know, there is always someone looking for a guru, for a leader, for a savior. And unfortunately for the Strack family, their father Benjamin and his wife Kristi found Dan Lafferty. The Strack family lived in Springville, Utah, which is a town south of Provo. They were Mormon, mainstream Mormon at one point, but then they started to develop some very extreme beliefs. This is something we have seen a lot of in Mormonism lately, and you have all told me, well, I shouldn't say you all have told me, but a lot of you have told me that you want to hear more about why that is. So I am working on an episode where I can try and break down for you my thoughts on why I believe so much extremism is coming out of Mormonism. And I'm going to hopefully bring in some other people that are going to give their thoughts on that as well. I want other people's thoughts and ideas on that. Sometimes I spend so much time by myself researching. Sometimes I wonder like if I'm in my own K-hole, my own echo chamber. So I try to watch that. But Benjamin and Kristi, the mom and dad of the Strack family, got very into this strange offshoot belief system, kind of like Lori Vallow and Chad Daybell did. And then Spring Thibodeau and her brother Brooke, remember these two shining stars that kidnapped Spring's teenage son to try to hide him in Alaska until Jesus came back to the earth next year. I cannot. These types of Mormons, and there's a lot of them recently, veer way off from mainstream Mormonism and end up in Crazy Valley, believing the apocalypse is right around the corner, and also that they're part of the 144,000 chosen to usher Jesus back into the earth, yada, yada, yada. We've heard so much of this. So what it seems like, and I say what it seems like because details on this are not super clear. It seems the Strack family were already kind of dabbling in some very extreme splinter beliefs that were not rooted in Mormonism, but are beliefs that are taught as part of mainstream Mormonism. So they'll take like a Mormon concept and then turn it into something completely bizarre. There are people that would say a lot of the Mormon doctrine is bizarre on its own, but they take it way, way, way farther. On top of that, and this is something I have kind of gleaned by viewing things on social media posted by the Strack family members that were not so close to the family, it appears that at times, both Ben and Kristi may have been dealing with some mental health issues, and they were also doing drugs. Now, if you know anything about Mormonism, drugs are definitely not part of the scene. Mormons don't even drink tea or coffee. They don't drink alcohol. Drugs are definitely not part of the scene. Now, legal drugs that come from the doctor, that's a whole other issue. We can talk about that if you'd like to, but illegal drugs are not part of Mormonism. Drugs that come from the doctor, very much so. Later on in this story, we find out that Kristi is receiving methadone treatment, and methadone is a medication used for opiate withdrawal. I don't know what kind of opioids Kristi had become addicted to, and I don't know when, but it's obvious that she was really struggling with some very serious issues, and I feel very sorry about that. But as always, I feel more sorry for her kids, as I can't imagine what that would be like, and my heart really goes out to these kids, and I feel for them. I'm sure watching your mother struggle with something like that is terrible. I'm sure some of you know what that's like. So things in the Strack family were not great. Ben and Kristi were not in a good place. They were delving into these really strange belief systems, very extreme. Kristi was obviously struggling with addiction. And then Kristi Strack claims that she had a dream about Dan Lafferty. Now, long before Hulu ever picked up on and produced the story of Under the Banner of Heaven, as I said, it was a book. I talk about that in the episodes about this story. But Mormons like us, we grew up with this book. I was told it was a bad book. I remember seeing the book in people's houses and thinking, oh, that's a bad book. They shouldn't have that. Now, why did I feel that way? because people had insinuated or out and out told me that the book was anti-Mormon. The book very clearly talks about the fact that Mormonism played a role in a horrific double murder. And when you are devoutly Mormon, especially back in the 1980s, 1990s, even the early 2000s, anything that mentions Mormonism in a negative light is anti-Mormon, period. That is what you are taught. I was raised very strictly and always being told that anything in print about the Mormon church that was not put out by the Mormon church was anti-Mormon. We were told very clearly to stay away from all of those kinds of things. So as a kid, Under the Banner of Heaven was an anti-Mormon book. I never read it. Not until years later, when I became very close friends with the woman whose sister and niece are the subjects of the book, did I read it. And it is not at all an anti-Mormon book. It is simply the story of this terrible murder. It does talk about how one of the officers has a faith crisis during this time. But even that is something you're not supposed to read about or hear about in Mormonism. A lot of Mormons view a faith crisis. I don't even like the word faith crisis because for me, it was a rebirth. It wasn't a crisis. There was crisis moments though, so that's the term that we use. But a lot of Mormons view a faith crisis as something that's contagious, because sometimes it is. Sometimes when you watch someone go through a faith crisis and you watch their lives completely transform and they're happy and they're so relieved and free and open, sometimes that is contagious. But this book does not make Mormonism look great at times. So everyone in Mormonism knows about Under the Banner of Heaven. And at some point, like a lot of Mormons did, Kristi Strack heard about the book. Then she started having these dreams about Dan Lafferty. Kristi started to become a little obsessed with Dan. And finally, she made the decision to reach out to his daughter. Now, I don't know which daughter this is. If you remember from episodes 1 and 2, Dan Lafferty actually ran for sheriff back in the 1980s. Why? Because he was angry at the laws and wanted to change them. The laws that said he could not marry his own daughter. You heard that right. I so wish you hadn't, but you did. Dan Lafferty wanted to marry his own 17-year-old daughter at one point. Some say he'd even been planning to marry her since she was 14. And when he found out that was against the law, he decided to run for sheriff to change that law. He lost, thank the heavens above. In this day and age, I don't know, he'd probably win and then immediately start banning science books and marrying his kids and other people's kids, because yeah, he's a pedo. It's definitely never the religious nut jobs that want to force 10-year-olds to give birth and allow them to get married when they're 12 years old. You know, I'll stop. So I don't know if the daughter that Kristi reached out to was the one that Dan wanted to marry or if it was another one. But this daughter puts Kristi in touch with Dan while he's in prison, and the Stracks, Ben and Kristi Strack, become good friends with Dan. They're like writing letters back and forth all the time. It's my understanding they would talk on the phone. And I've read reports that the Stracks visited Dan quite often in prison. I don't know how much of this was going on. I want to be clear. Again, these kinds of personal details, not only in this story, but many others, I have to find things like that on Reddit, on Facebook posts and things like that. News sites don't report, the nuances of these kinds of relationships. And often, as within stories like this one, the family is kind of isolated. So you have to take everything with a little grain of salt. I just like to disclose that when I'm talking about these things. But I did read a lot of reports that said the Stracks were very close to Dan Lafferty. So close that, you guys, Dan Lafferty cut off his nasty ass 3-foot long beard and his waist length skullet and mailed it to the Strack family. He sent them his goddamn beard, you guys, and I just cannot. From time to time, I sometimes talk about a spaceship that I would like to swoop down and beam me up because I just can't believe some of the dumb shit I find out while researching these stories. The spaceship would have to take my husband and all my kids and my 2 grandkids and any of you that want to come along, but I'm getting on that spaceship if it ever comes, because I just want to maybe try somewhere else. Somewhere where a married couple doesn't get obsessed with the murderer of a toddler and they're all so in love that he cuts off his prophet beard and skullet and sends them into the mail to be delivered to that family. Anyway, we'll start a list for the spaceship later on, and I'll get you all on. We'll go together. Dan Lafferty actually told people that he and Kristi were in love, and that's why he cut off his waist-length hair and beard and sent them to her. Now, how Ben felt about Kristi being in love with a murdering maniac, self-proclaimed prophet baby killer in jail for life, I don't know. As you can tell, I have zero feelings about this. You know me, I never have an opinion. But apparently they were in love. And I kind of got the idea that maybe things got a little hot and heavy between Dan and Kristi, because in 2018, Kristi Strack took her brother to the prison to visit Dan, but she tried to pass her brother off as her husband. So I was like, why would she not want to take Ben, her actual husband, to see this guy they were obsessed with? Was she hiding something? You also have to take into account that it is quite a process to get on the visitor list for certain prisoners. Maybe her brother wasn't on the list and didn't want to go through the process of getting on that list, but really wanted to meet Dan or something. So Kristi tried to pass her brother off as her husband, Ben, and Ben had been approved, but the prison caught her. I don't know why she thought she was going to pull this stunt off, but as she was caught trying to pass her brother off as her husband, the prison caught her, and it's a very serious offense in their eyes. That ended up getting Kristi banned from visiting Dan in prison forever. I have never been to a state prison to visit someone. I have had plenty of opportunities to do that, but I never have. But apparently there are very strict guidelines about getting in, IDing people, and you cannot use somebody else's ID for something like that. So Kristi was blacklisted from in-person visits. The couple did keep in contact with Dan. And later on, Dan would talk about this period of time and the revelations that he would share with the Stracks. In Mormonism, believers are taught and believe that they can receive personal revelation from God. Mormons are taught that everyone is capable of receiving revelations from God, with the caveat being those personal revelations are for you and you only. Because of course, we can't have everyone running around willy-nilly spouting revelations. How on earth does the church keep control over people like that? So the doctrine and the rules are only the prophet of the Mormon church receives revelation that applies to other people. The Mormon prophet is a man, always a man. He changes, one dies and another one is put into his place. But Dan always believed that he was the one true prophet of God, and so he would have these revelations and share them with the Stracks. So the Stracks and Dan have been in this situationship for about 3 years when Kristi loses her visitation rights in 2008. But something else happened in 2008 involving the kids. The Stracks had 4 adorable kids. The eldest was named Jansen, and then there was Benson, Emery, and little Zion. Now, I'm going to tell you, I have a very difficult time with this because everything I have read about these people, Ben especially, people that knew them say Ben was the nicest man on the face of the earth. People remember him as just happy and joyful, a really beautiful person who would do anything for anybody. He was someone everyone seemed to love and liked being around and seemed to be a genuinely good guy. Now, this is very difficult for me to hear. I don't want to dishonor anyone's feelings about the Ben that they knew, but I did not know that Ben. I know a Ben who violated every human standard of what a parent is. I know a Ben who did the unthinkable. Same for Kristi, and we'll talk about this more in a moment, but I do think it's an important part of the story to say that the people who knew this family loved them. The kids were awesome. The little boy loved animals and his friends. The kids were friendly and they were well known in the neighborhood. All good things. But then things really began to change. In 2008, the same year Kristi got banned from the prison, Ben and Kristi pulled their kids out of school and began homeschooling them. We have talked about homeschooling here on this channel before, and I understand that it's a very touchy and divisive subject. I completely understand that there are parents who engage in homeschooling that are very loving and competent and wonderful, who just want their kids to have the best. In my opinion, I will state this again because I believe in transparency, homeschooling is not something I would do. I do not believe it offers kids the social experience they need and frankly deserve to have if they want it, which most kids do. I don't have a problem saying that. We can agree to disagree. But I'm also going to admit to you my bias. I am open about that. As someone who does this kind of research 50, 60 hours a week, when I go to certain cases, before I get all the way into the research, I will often say to myself, this is going to be a homeschooling family. And to date, I have not been wrong. Now, I'm sure that day is coming because I'm wrong all the time. But today, when I guess this is going to involve homeschooling, it does. Does that mean homeschooling is bad? No. Does it mean that homeschooling is an attractive way for controlling parents with very extreme beliefs to maintain total control over their kids and what they're exposed to? Sure as hell does. Sure as hell does. Homeschooling is definitely attractive for parents with very extreme beliefs who do not want their kids to be exposed to the real world, to anything but their extreme beliefs. I truly believe that, and I will stand by that statement. As the Strack family's beliefs become more and more extreme, their desire to keep their kids close to them, scratch that, their desire to control their children and their beliefs grew more intense. Let's just call it what it is. Dan Lafferty believes, and has believed for many years, that he is the prophet Elijah. So let's talk a little bit about Elijah so we understand what he's pushing here. Elijah plays a very big role in the Quran, but we're talking about the Elijah of the Bible here. In the book of Kings, Elijah defends the worship of the Hebrew God over the worship of the deity Baal. Baal was the Canaanite god of fertility, rain, wind, etc. God also performs a series of miracles through Elijah, including resurrection, after God rains fire from the sky, taking Elijah up to heaven, where he enters heaven on fire, but still alive. So we've already got ties here to the apocalypse. Very strong apocalypse vibes in Elijah's story. In Malachi, Elijah's return to the earth is prophesied coming before the great and terrible day of the Lord. So Elijah is said to be a harbinger of the apocalypse. Elijah's return to earth will be a sign of the apocalypse. So you can see where this is heading. Elijah is also believed to be John the Baptist. They're one and the same. Elijah also meets Moses, but his strongest presence has to do with bringing in the apocalypse, the second coming of Christ. And in this theology, Mormon theology, Bible theology, the second coming of Christ is preceded by the great and terrible day, a period of wars and rumors of wars and, plagues and pestilence and fire and all that. So if Dan Lafferty is the prophet Elijah, that means what to people that believe it? It's time for the apocalypse. If Elijah has returned to the earth, as is prophesied in the Bible, that means the end is near. Ben and Kristi Strack become convinced that Dan Lafferty, their prophet Elijah, is on this earth to bring in the apocalypse. And once this idea is set in their minds, things go downhill very quickly. I spent quite a bit of time on a few Facebook pages where family members are conversing about what happens next. And I do this because it gives me the only insight I have into what those around the family were dealing with. Again, this is something the news doesn't report on. As I was reading through these threads and these posts, what became clear to me is that between around 2010 and 2014, the Stracks pulled further and further away from everyone. I read posts by Ben's brother, Jake, that stated he had true hatred in his heart for Kristi at times because she basically cut the family off from everyone who loved them. Kristi seems to be the driving force in all of this, but I do want to point out that I read some of Ben's family members saying, hey, he had his own free agency. Yes, Kristi was definitely the one who was way off the deep end, but Ben was there too. I read one post that said the family tried and tried to reach out to Kristi and to Ben because they were concerned. Now, why were they so concerned? Obviously, they've pulled the kids out of school. They've cut off all communication. And I read one post that said, quote, "It is a big thing to acknowledge that, yes, we would have all liked to have been there for Ben and the kids this entire time. It was not for lack of trying. There was a wall that was totally impenetrable most of the time." So you have to feel for this family. These are people that they love and they can't get through to them. They won't even let them see the kids or talk to them. Very similar to Lori Vallow and Chad Daybell. Very, very similar to Ruby Franke. Like I said, we're seeing this a lot. Anyone who wants to isolate you for one reason, so they can have complete control over you. Never forget that. Kristi had managed to build this impenetrable wall where she had total control over Ben, and she had cut him off again from his family. But Ben had to allow that and agree with it on some level. He's a grown adult. It does sound like it was a very difficult situation, but he is an adult. I read one really sad little story of a boy who was friends with Zion, and he said, Zion was really shy and not used to being around people, so when we would play together, I would try and help him get used to other people. This is why I don't like this kind of stuff, homeschooling and stuff. These kids are just literal prisoners. They're prisoners of the crazy, and I just hate it. But it is apparent that people who knew the Stracks felt completely cut off from the family, and they see Kristi as the instigator and the reason for that isolation. It does appear that Kristi continued to have a relationship with her own mother. That comes into play here in a moment, but it looks like she cut off most other people in her life. Because of the isolated way the family was living, there are really no details as to what was happening in the days leading up to this terrible event at the heart of the story. We know that people who knew Kristi and Ben were convinced that Kristi was mentally ill, and perhaps Ben too. I'm not trying to beat anyone up over calls that weren't made to CPS or welfare checks that weren't demanded. I'm sure those people that are involved have beat themselves up enough over that. But you know, here at Dark Hearts, we always like to take something from these stories. And today I think the lesson is, if you think something bad is going on, be that nosy neighbor. Be that very vocal and insistent neighbor, like in the Ruby Frankie case. Demand those kids get that welfare check. I'm not trying to beat anybody up over this. I'm just saying the lesson that we take away from this, get involved. I would much rather be yelled at and told to mind my own business than live the rest of my life knowing I could have done something and didn't. People were concerned. They were anxious. They were sad, and they were missing friends and family members who had withdrawn from their lives. But I know that no one was prepared for what happened next. The oldest son, Jansen, along with a girlfriend of his, walk into the Strack family home here, which is located in a quiet suburb in Springville, Utah. The house is eerily quiet. When Jansen walked into the house, he was 18 at the time. He's a perceptive kid because he knew something was very, very wrong. He felt it. It was such a strong feeling that he turned around and walked out of the house without going any further. He hadn't seen anything, but he just knew. His grandma lived only a few houses down from the family, and so he walked down the street and to his grandma's house. Her name is Valerie Sudweeks, and she is Kristi's mother. Jansen and Valerie walk back down to the Strack family house and go inside. What they find is the worst thing you can imagine. A 911 call was placed to the Springville Police Department, in which the girlfriend told the dispatcher, "The whole family is dead. They've killed themselves." Ben and Kristi Strack are on their bed in the main bedroom of the house. The bodies of their 3 youngest children were placed all around the bed, covered in bedding up to their necks. Benson, 14, Emery, 12, and Zion, 11, had been positioned around the bed, and the entire family was dead. Near each of the dead bodies was a cup of red liquid. Someone, either Ben or Kristi, I think it was Ben, had placed the children where they were and covered them after they were dead. 37-year-old Benjamin was laying with his arm and his leg draped over 36-year-old Kristi. Ben was also on top of the bed covers while Kristi was underneath them. That's why I assume it was Ben who was left to place the children. Ben had a lethal dose of heroin in his system. He had injected himself after the rest of the family was dead. The family had all ingested liquid laced with methadone, dextrorphan, diphenhydramine, and doxylamine. There were empty bottles of methadone all around the house. The deaths of Emery and Zion were ruled homicide. Benson, who was 14, had written notes leaving all of his personal property to friends of his. This poor kid knew that he was going to die. He knew. But the police cannot make a determination as to what his state of mind was, whether he even was old enough to make a decision like this because of the extensive brainwashing. So his manner of death officially remains undetermined. Ben and Kristi were obviously labeled as suicides, and they are and should be labeled as the murderers of their children. I have compassion for the people of this family. I do. And if you're one of those people, I would say don't watch the rest of this episode. I've got nothing really from here on out good to say about Ben or Kristi, and I don't care how loving and fun and kind they were when they were younger. I just don't. I don't even care how on drugs they were, because that was also their choice. A lot of us struggle with mental illness. A lot of us struggle with drugs. We don't kill our babies. Parents are held to a higher standard. When it comes to our babies, I don't want to hear excuses. You murdered your babies, period. You isolated them, you brainwashed them, you terrified them into believing the world was going to burn in hellfire, and then you killed them. That's who these people are to me. They might have been someone else to others, and I acknowledge that. To me, they're monsters. Later on, people would talk about the fact that Ben and Kristi had made statements about leaving the world. Apparently, the people that they said that to thought they were going to move to Montana and live off the grid. Someone said they had said some of those things. They were going to move and buy a ranch and live off the grid. So I understand how that could be mistaken. I also acknowledge it is real easy to Monday morning quarterback from this chair. I acknowledge that. I admit that. But I also know that because I am nosy as hell and very vocal and insistent, that if someone I know tells me they're leaving this world, I'm calling CPS. Die mad about it. I'm calling them. You can be mad at me. Sometimes I think if I talk through this enough, I can make it feel better, you know? I even read some reports that people thought they were referring to suicide. So I'm kind of wondering why they weren't committed. I know that's a tough process. But what is a little more frustrating is, why did they still have those kids? I would like some answers on that. I don't know if anyone has answers, but like I said, someone did post that they tried to get through to them. I would like to know why Ben and Kristi still have their kids. And again, I know I'm Monday morning quarterbacking and I know I'm judging, but we have to talk about this and we have to try to learn something from these stories. And what we need to take away from this one is to get more involved. It's better than to live with the guilt you'll live with forever for doing nothing, you know? Now, even with all the harsh things I've said, I want to send love from our community to the surviving family members. What you have been through is a nightmare. I'm sorry that there are people like me talking shit about people that you loved. I am. That must be difficult. And I hope you know that for me personally, I do this because, yes, I have a community that likes to learn about these dark events, but we also like to study these events in order to learn how to prevent them. And unlike murders by strangers and other things we talk about, I do think things like this are preventable. I'm a broken record on this, but we must make mental health care services not only more available, but more affordable. We must work to erase the stigma of seeking help through a mental health center or a professional. There is no stigma attached to seeking medical help for a physical ailment or disease, and there shouldn't be a stigma attached to seeking help for a mental ailment or disease. We must also work to break the bond and the acceptance of untrained religious leaders acting as mental health counselors, and this case is the perfect example of why. Had the Stracks sought counseling in this particular culture, they would have been referred to a bishop or a religious therapist, and that is the last thing they needed. Ben and Kristi were dealing with drugs, something they wouldn't have felt comfortable talking with a religious counselor about, and they were dealing with severe mental illnesses. They needed professional help, not a religious counselor. Let's all, in our respective communities and our own little bubbles, work to erase that stigma surrounding mental health problems. There is nothing any of us can do to help Benson, Emery, or Zion. What we can do is talk about stories like this so more of us become aware of just how dangerous even parents can become when they go off the deep end. You've heard me say this 100 times. Extremism in any form is dangerous. Extreme beliefs are dangerous. Losing touch with reality is dangerous. Not accepting the opinions of experts is dangerous. It is dangerous for the person on the edge, and even worse, it's dangerous for those in their charge. Please, my friends, if you see something, say something. If you are concerned, be your brother's keeper. Do not let your fear of being embarrassed or getting yelled at by an angry friend who wants you to butt out stop you from being the guardian angel that these kids needed. I'm not saying getting involved is the easy thing to do, but I am saying it's the right thing to do. Whew, not a real fun story today. I sure appreciate you tuning in though. Please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you want to see more from me. It does help. You can also join my Patreon. We have a big goal there, and it's this. We are raising money to donate to police departments that have cold case DNA kits in storage. Sorry. I just can't stop thinking about those kids. Sexual assault kits that have never been tested because there's no money. We would like to raise money, pick a case, get that kit tested, and hopefully solve the crime. The other thing that happens is we get that perpetrator's DNA in the system forever. I want you to know how much I appreciate each and every one of you. Together, we are going to do great things. It is taking a lot longer than I thought it would, but I feel it. I feel it. Stay safe, my friends, and be kind to each other. And I will see you next time on Dark Hearts with Stacy Lee. Bye.